In this lecture, we are going to talk about one of the most important topics of JavaScript language, which is closures. Closures is one of the most crucial and advanced topics of JavaScript language, and it is also one of the most difficult to understand topics for JavaScript beginners. Closures is also one such topic which is frequently asked in interviews, and that's why understanding closures is very important. In order to understand closures, you should have a prior understanding of few topics like what is execution context and call stack, what is a variable object. You should know what is a scope and scope chain, and you should also know how function returning another function works in JavaScript. I have already covered all these topics in my previous lectures, so if you are following along this course from the beginning, then you already know what you need to know in order to understand closures in JavaScript. However, I will still give you a brief recap of all these topics before talking about closures. So we have learned that when a function is called, an execution context for that function gets created in the call stack. For example, let's say we have this very simple function called func. This function is taking two parameters, x and y, and inside this function we are declaring three variables a, b, and c. And then we are trying to add the values of these variables and parameters and return them from this function. Now, when we call this func function, an execution context for this func function will get created in the call stack, as you can see in this diagram. So here we have two execution context. One is the global execution context and other is the execution context for func function. In the global execution context, all the global variables and functions will get executed. And in the func execution context, in the execution context of this func function, the variables and parameters of this func function will be stored, and the logic inside this func function will get executed inside this execution context. Now, every execution context has a property called as variable object, and it is this variable object which stores all the variables and function parameters. So the execution context of this func function will have a property called as variable object, and it is this variable object of the execution context of that function which will store all the variables which we have declared inside this function, and it will also store the parameters which this function is taking, as you can see in this diagram. If you want to learn the variable objects in more detail, then please go through the variable object lecture of this course. We have also learned that there are three types of scopes in JavaScript: global scope, local scope, and lexical scope. So, what is a global scope? A variable or a function is said to be in a global scope if it is not defined inside any other function or code block. Let's understand this with an example. Here we have a very simple JavaScript program. Now in this program, this variable a is not present inside any other function or code block. So this variable a is a global variable. Similarly, this outer function is also not defined inside any other function or code block. So this outer function is a global function. And in the same way, since this value variable is also not defined inside any other function or code block, this value variable is also a global variable. Now, a global variable or a global function can be accessed from anywhere within the program. And the global variables and global functions are stored in the variable object of global execution context. Another type of scope is the local scope. A variable is said to be in a local scope if it can be accessed only within the function or code block where it is declared. In the same example, this variable b is declared inside the outer function. So this variable b can be accessed only inside this outer function. It cannot be accessed outside of this outer function. Similarly, this inner function is declared inside this outer function. So this inner function is also local to this outer function. That means this inner function cannot be used outside of this outer function. This inner function will not be visible outside of this outer function. So here in this example, this variable b and this inner function is local to this outer function. That means they have a local scope. They can only be accessed or they are only visible inside the function in which they are declared. Similarly, inside this inner function, we have this variable c declared. So this variable c is local to this inner function. That means this variable c cannot be accessed outside of this inner function. And this is called as local scope. Then we have lexical scope. So a function or a code block sitting lexically within another function or code block will have access to all the variables and functions of its outer function or code block. Let's understand this with an example. In this example, this inner function is declared inside this outer function. So this inner function is sitting lexically within this outer function. And since this inner function is sitting lexically, that means it is defined inside this outer function, this inner function will have access to all the variables and functions which is declared inside the outer function. So in this example, this inner function will automatically have access to this variable b because this inner function is sitting lexically within this outer function. So because of lexical scoping, this inner function can access this variable b and it can use it inside its body. And this is called as lexical scoping. If you want to learn more about scope and scope chain, then please go through the scope and scope chain lecture of this course. So now that you have the brief idea of all the topics which you need to know in order to understand closures, let's now talk about closures in JavaScript. A closure is a function that remembers its outer variables and can access them. Let's understand this statement with an example. In this simple JavaScript program, we are declaring a global variable a, and then we also have this global function called outer. And here we are calling this outer function. So when this function will get called, the body of this outer function will get executed. And inside the body of this outer function, first we are declaring this variable b, we are also declaring this inner function, and then we are calling this inner function. Now this inner function is a local to this outer function. So this inner function cannot be accessed outside of this outer function. Okay, if I try to use this inner function outside of this outer function, we will get an error. As you can see, inner is not defined. And this is because this inner function is not visible outside of this outer function. All right. So this inner function is local to this outer function. Then we are calling this inner function here. So when this inner function is called, the body of this inner function will get executed. Inside this inner function, we are declaring this variable c, and we are assigning it with the value 30. And then we are trying to add the values of the variable a, b, and c and return it. Now this variable c is declared inside this inner function. So this inner function automatically has access to this variable c and it can use it. But this variable b is not declared inside this inner function. It is declared inside this outer function. And since this inner function is sitting lexically within this outer function, this inner function will have access to this variable b because of lexical scope. And that's why inside this inner function, we can use this variable b. This inner function will also have access to this variable a because this variable a is a global variable. And a global variable can be accessed from anywhere within the program. So here this inner function has access to this variable a, b, and c. So it will be able to calculate the sum of the values of variable a, b, and c, and the sum will be 60. right? So 10 plus 20 plus 30 is 60. So this expression is going to evaluate to this value 60, and then from this inner function we are returning that value. So 60 will be returned from this inner function, and we will receive that value where we are calling this inner function. So here we will receive this value 60. And again, we are returning that received value, this value 60, which this inner function has returned, from this outer function using this return keyword. So again, this outer function is going to return this same value 60, and we will receive it where we are calling this outer function. So here we will receive this value 60, and we are assigning it to this value variable. And in order to check if we are getting the correct output, let's log this value variable. So if I save the changes, here you can see in the developer console 60 has been logged. So this program is working as expected. Now let's try to understand how this program will get executed behind the scenes. Here we have the same program which you saw in the code editor. Now we have learned that when we run a JavaScript program in the browser, first of all, a global execution context gets created, and every execution context has a variable object. So let's say this global execution context has this variable object. And inside the variable object of the global execution context, all the global variables and functions will be stored as its property. So here, first of all, a property for this variable A will be created in the variable object of global execution context. Similarly, a property for outer function will be created, and it will point to the definition of the outer function. And here at this line, a property for this value variable will be created, and to this we are trying to assign the value returned by this outer function. So before a property for this value variable gets created, this outer function will be called. When this outer function is called, the control will reach to the definition of the outer function, and an execution context for the outer function will get created in call stack. And this execution context of this outer function will also have a variable object, and this variable object will store all the variables which is declared inside this outer function, and if any parameters is there, that will also get stored inside this variable object. But this outer function is not taking any parameters, so all the variables which is declared inside this outer function and the function definitions will be stored inside this variable object of outer function. So a property for this variable b will be created, and a property for this inner function will also get created, which will point to the definition of this inner function. And this outer function will have access to all the global variables and functions. That means the variable object of this outer function will have access to the variable object of global execution context. And since the variable object of this outer function has access to the variable object of global execution context, inside this outer function, we can use this variable A, which is stored in the variable object of global execution context. All right, so this is the scope chain for outer function. And because of this scope chain, this outer function has access to variable b and inner function, and it will also have access to variable a and the outer function. So inside this outer function, we can use this variable a, or we can call this outer function. All right. Then at this line, we are calling the inner function. So this inner function will be called. An execution context for this inner function will be created on top of the execution context of outer function. And this execution context of this inner function will also have a variable object. And this variable object will contain all the variables which is declared inside this inner function. Inside this inner function, we are declaring this variable c. So this variable c will be stored inside the variable object of this inner function. And since this inner function is sitting lexically within this outer function, the variable object of this inner function will have access to the variable object of outer function. And the variable object of this inner function will also have access to the variable object of global execution context. And because of this, inside this inner function, we can use all the variables and functions which is stored in the variable object of outer function, as well as all the variables and functions which is stored in the variable object of global execution context. So this is the scope chain for inner function. And because of this scope chain, this inner function will always remember the variables and functions to which it has access to. And this is called as closures in JavaScript. Similarly, because of the scope chain of this outer function will always remember the variables and functions which it has access to. Okay, and this is called as closures in JavaScript. Now this inner function returns at this line. So it will calculate the sum of a, b, and c, and it will return. And when a function returns, we have learned that the execution context of that function gets popped off from the execution stack. And since the variable object is a part of execution context, since the execution context has been removed from the call stack, the variable object of that execution context also gets removed, from the scope chain. Then at this line, we are also returning from outer function. So the execution context of the outer function is also, popped off from the call stack. And with that, the variable object of outer execution context is also gone. We are back to the line from where we called the outer function. Now this outer function has returned some value, so that value will be assigned to this value variable, and a property for this value variable will get created in the variable object of global execution context. So this is how this program will be executed behind the scenes. Now what we have learned about closures? A closure is a function that remembers its outer variables and can access them. And in this example, this inner function is able to remember its outer variables because of the scope chain, because of this scope chain. Similarly, this outer function is able to remember its outer variables, that means the global variables and functions, because of this scope chain. Okay? Now, let's take a look at another example. Let's modify this JavaScript program a little bit. So instead of calling this inner function and returning the value returned by this inner function, what we want to do is we want to return the inner function itself. Okay, so now we are returning a function from within this outer function. And which function we are returning? We are returning this inner function. That means this function will be returned from this outer function. So when we are calling this outer function here, this time at this line, this inner function will be returned. Okay, and here when we are calling this outer function, here we will receive this inner function, and this inner function will get assigned to this value variable. So here when we are logging this value variable, this time when I save the changes, you will see that the definition of the returned function has been logged here. Now if you want to execute this returned function, you can simply use parenthesis on the variable inside which this function has been stored. So we have stored this returned function inside this value variable. So when we use parenthesis on that variable, the function stored in that variable will be executed. And this function is going to return some value. So let's store it in a variable. Let's call it sum. Okay, and now let's log this sum variable. If I save the changes, still the program is working fine and it has logged this value 60. Now let's understand how this program will be executed behind the scenes. So here we have the modified JavaScript program. Now when we run this program, first of all a global execution context will get created, it will have a variable object which will store all the global variables and functions. At this line, we are calling this outer function. Okay, so before a property gets created for this value variable in the variable object of global execution context, before that, this outer function will be called. Okay, and an execution context for this outer function will get created, and this execution context will also have a variable object. Inside this variable object, all the variables which is declared inside this outer function will be stored. And the variable object of this outer function will have access to the variable object of global execution context. Okay, then we are returning from this outer function. And what are we returning from this outer function? We are returning the definition of this inner function. Okay, so when we return from a function, the execution context of that function gets popped off from the execution stack. And with that, the variable object is also gone. So here at this line, this outer function is going to return, you know, the definition of this inner function, and that will be assigned to this value variable. So in the variable object of global execution context, a property called as value will be created, and that property will point to the definition of the function which this outer function has returned. That means to this inner function. Then at this line, we are using parenthesis on this value variable. Now, what is this value variable storing? It is storing the definition of this inner function. So again, this function will be called, and an execution context for this function will be created in the execution stack, and this execution context will have a variable object, and this execution context is for this function which we have returned from the outer function. Okay, and we know that the global variables and functions can be accessed from anywhere within the program. That means any function can access the variable object of global execution context. And that's why the variable object of this execution context will have access to the variable object of global execution context. Okay, now inside this inner function, we are declaring this variable C. So first of all, this variable C will be, a property for this variable C will be created in the variable object of this function. To the variable object of this execution context. Now, inside this function, we are also trying to use the variables A, B, and C. So this variable C is present in the variable object of this function. So it will have access to this variable C. This variable A is present in the variable object of global execution context. And since the variable object of this function has access to the variable object of global execution context, it will be able to use this variable A. But this variable B is not present in any of these variable objects, any of these two variable objects. Okay, so in the scope chain, if you notice, we have two variable objects and none of them has this variable B. But still, when we run this program, we get the correct output. So here, when we are running this program, somehow we are getting the correct output, which is 60. But from where it is getting the value of this variable B? Because just now we have seen that in the scope chain, we don't have this variable B, right? In this scope chain, we don't have this variable B. This variable B was present in the variable object of the execution context of outer function. And that execution context has already popped off from the execution stack. And with that, the variable object is also gone. But somehow this inner function is able to remember the value of this variable B, and it is able to use it. And this is called as closures in JavaScript. Okay, so even though this outer function, the execution context of this outer function has popped off from the execution stack, and with that, the variable B, which was stored in the variable object of the execution context of outer function, is also gone. Still, this inner function remembers that variable and it is able to use its value inside it. And this is called as closures in JavaScript. So a closure is a function that remembers its outer variable and can access them. So in this example, this inner function remembers the variables of its outer function and it is able to access them and use it. Okay, so this inner function remembers all the variables and functions of its outer function, and this is called as closures in JavaScript. So every function in JavaScript automatically remembers where they were created. So this inner function will always remember that it was created inside this outer function. And because of this, it will also remember all the outer variables and functions of its outer function. Okay, so since JavaScript automatically remembers, JavaScript functions automatically remembers where they were created. Because of this, they remember all the outer function variables which they have access to. And this is possible because execution context of a function uses a hidden environment property, and then their code can access outer variables with the help of this environment property. And this is called as closures in JavaScript. Remember that all functions in JavaScript are closures. We have seen two examples where a function remembers its outer variables. One example was where we saw that the function remembers its outer variable because of the scope chain, and in another example, the inner function, remembers its outer variables even though it is not present, that those variables are not present in the scope chain. Okay, so all the functions in JavaScript are closures because they always remember the variables of its outer function.